James, big strong guy with mental health issues. I want to tell you a little bit about an inmate that we used to deal with. He was housed in the hospital. When I worked there, he was housed there for many, many years in the acute mental health area. This guy had some mental health issues, some disability as far as not autistic, but I guess you would say mentally handicapped. And he was in prison for assault. He was not a real tall guy. He was probably about 5'8", 5'9", but he was built strong. And he was the guy that, if you had to fight him, you better have some help, and you better be on your A game. He was just a strong guy. But I want to just sort of give you an example of the kind of guys you dealt with back in the day. They don't have these cells now. I don't advocate that they have them now. But we had 12 cells in the acute hospital with acute mental health that we would house guys. And most of the time it was guys who had attempted suicide, who'd hurt themselves, who had threatened to hurt themselves, and so you would put them in these acute cells on what was referred to as suicide precaution, and it would entail, or mental health observation. Suicide precaution, they wouldn't have anything except for a mattress and boxers on. You wouldn't give them anything that they might could harm themselves with, to make a rope out of, to hang themselves, that kind of thing. And well, James Jones, he was such a violent inmate that you couldn't house him in a regular population. And he couldn't be handled in the regular mental health population. So he ended up being housed in the acute cells at Central Prison Hospital, in the old hospital, I should say, as that hospital no longer exists, has been torn down now. But you had 6 cells on each floor. And he was so hard to handle with the nurses and with staff that he would spend like 2 weeks on one floor, then we'd move him to the other floor for 2 weeks and sort of give each floor a break. And how we had to handle him is that you would have to have a sergeant and 3 officers to just get him out of the cell. He'd have to be in full restraints. And you sort of learn dealing with him on what days that you may or may not have problems with. And so we would have to get him out to let him take a shower. And what we did is, based on how he was reacting and carrying himself, sometimes he was not taken out for a shower because he was dangerous. And unfortunately, when you're dealing with someone like that, I mean, people just don't understand. He was highly medicated, and the medication didn't seem to have effect on him. It would calm him down a little bit, and he was on multiple different medications such as Thorazine. I can't remember all the other ones that he was on. He was on several different medications, and it was basically so we could just manage him. And it went on for years, and for the most part, you could go in, you could talk to him and carry on a little bit. He'd carry on a conversation. Not a complex conversation, but he would talk with him. And he dealing with him in a cell was not as much of an issue. If he was in one of his moods, then he just would not respond to you. He'd lay on his bunk and he'd just look away from you. If he was in a good mood, he'd come up and talk to you. But he was dangerous. And to give you an idea, but he wasn't stupid, is that we had a nurse at one time, and this was very wrong, but she would go back and she would taunt James. She would take a candy bar and she would go in there and she'd say, "Hey, James," and she would eat it in front of him, and just sort of taunting him over and over and over. And it was not right, it was wrong. And so one day I don't know whether this was someone did this on purpose. Don't think so. But someday, someone went to get James out for a shower for some reason, and when they shut the door back, they did not lock it back. And those cells had basically slide bar bolts on them, and then you put a padlock on it to hold it down. Well, they didn't put the padlock and lock it down. And so James, all he had to do was reach out the food passage door and reached in, and he could open the door. And that's what he did on this day. And this day, that nurse happened to be working. And so he opens that door, and when he starts coming out of the cell, out into the hallway where the nurses were, they panicked. And the nursing station had an outer area which was open to the hallway, and then a back office. And all of them took off to the back office and shut the door. But before they could get there, he had the nurse that had been toning him in a corner in the front area. And he had her cornered, and he said that he was going to get him some. And if you know what I mean, you know what I mean. And he laughed about it. He just sort of laughed, ha, 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 ha. And he kept saying, I'm going to get me some. I'm going to get me some. And they called for staff to come. And one of the lieutenants, and I was working there at the time, was a sergeant. I was on second shift. This happened on first shift. But the lieutenant, he came up. All of the available officers came up, and they just knew that they were going to have a fight on their hands. They just knew it. Because we've had issues that they've had to deal with him, and they've had to fight him to be able to manage him, to be able to, to get him from one place to the other. And so the lieutenant, Moore, he's passed on now. He talked to James, and what he ended up doing was bribing James with a cigarette. James liked to smoke, and back those days they could smoke, not in the hospital. And so what he did, he offered him a cigarette and said, hey, look, James, I'll give you a cigarette if you go back to your cell. And James he wanted that cigarette. And so he went on back to his cell, and he gave him the cigarette and let him smoke it and got him in there, and he was under control. But I truly believe James knew what he was doing. I don't think he had no intention of hurting the nurse, but he wanted to teach her a lesson. And he did teach her a lesson. She never, ever did that kind of thing again. And it was when that happened and sort of when it came out what she had done. And it wasn't too many months or weeks, well, it may have been a couple months after that, she ended up leaving and left. And so, even these guys whose minds were not all there right, you needed to treat them right, respectfully. Now, thankfully, a few years later, James, they got some new medication on him, and he actually had a turnaround where they were able to move him to regular mental health, put him in the regular mental health population. And a few years later, he ended up being discharged. He was released. And they didn't release him on the street. They released him to a mental health facility that could handle him. And I'm not sure whether or not he's still living today. He ended up he's not been back into prison. But those are the kind of individuals that I dealt with, especially when I worked in the hospital setting for about 4 years, dealt with all kind of mental health patients all the time. And he was one of the unique guys that you never forget. And you get all kinds of guys that you deal with while you're in prison or while you're working there, and you never forget them. And those are the kinds of guys you always remember their names. It was not the guys that stay out of trouble, never problems. And I've had people ask me, hey, did you know this person or that person who was incarcerated? And unless they were a troublemaker, most of the time I didn't. And unless, if they were in maybe a job that worked for me as a janitor or something, I might remember their name, maybe. But a lot of times I didn't even remember their name. So that's the story of James and that unique person that he was. And so, hope you enjoy the story. Till next time, have a great day.